Top 20 80s Horror Movies. The 80s were a glorious time for cinema, and horror movies were no exception to that rule. Some of the greatest films of the genre ever made were in the awesome 80s, and as part of my horror series I hereby present to you my personal favorite top 20 horror films from this fantastic decade. Fuck, I miss it so. 20. An American Werewolf in London. Still the greatest werewolf movie ever made, An American Werewolf in London remains a comedy horror classic, and these days also offers a delicious capsule of early 80s Britain to boot. Take note of two future stars of iconic British cop show the bill appearing here as cops, namely John Salthouse, who played the fire ADI Roy Galloway from 1984 to 1986 as a uniformed officer during the cinema scenes toward the end, and Peter Ellis, who played Chief Superintendent Charles Brownlow from 1984 to 2000, as a uniformed PC who David tries to get arrested by. It also has the great John Woodvine delivering perhaps the greatest single line in the history of cinema. I'm sure if there were a monster roaming around the north of England, we'd have seen it on the telly. 19. Halloween 4. Still one of my favorites of the sequels, good, enjoyable scary schlock. Earns extra points for having a very young Danielle Harris, who I've liked ever since Roseanne, as Michael's prime target, which in itself adds extra frisson to the fear that his main quarry is someone so young and completely defenseless. Good fun. 18. Maniac Cop. A lunatic killer is stalking the streets of New York, a lunatic wearing the uniform of a police officer. Whether he's an imposter or a real cop turned psycho, the residents of New York are getting decidedly antsy. Young cop Bruce Campbell finds himself framed as the murderer and the police force is only too happy to accept his guilt, save for veteran detective Tom Atkins, who is convinced the real madman is still at large. Very entertaining late 80s tongue-in-cheek horror thriller B-movie that is still great fun. 17. Poltergeist. Forget the typically lame and utterly unnecessary modern remake gobshite, go back to the original 80s fun spook house flick and marvel at the charm, atmosphere and sheer class of it all. It's so very Spielbergian that if he didn't direct it, as many have suggested he did, he may as well have done. 16. Cat's Eye. This mid-80s anthology flick of three Stephen King stories, connected by the loose thread of the titular feline who gets involved in all, is a funny and creepy delight that has always been one of my favorites, and still is. Always go back to this every few years, it's just so much fun and remains wildly underrated and far more obscure than it deserves to be. This may well be the best King movie ever made. 15. Halloween 2. Picking up directly after the events of the original, Laurie, Jamie Lee Curtis, is taken to hospital as Dr. Loomis, Donald Pleasance, and the local police continue their hunt for escaped maniac Michael Myers. But Myers hasn't finished with Laurie just yet. Enjoyable sequel that starts strong, wavers a little in the midsection but rallies for a final half hour that's genuinely exciting and scary. Classic stuff. 14. Q the Winged Serpent. An ancient giant bird once worshipped as a god by the Aztecs is flying the skies of New York, picking off victims. David Carradine is a cop who thinks the bird's appearance is somehow linked to a set of sacrificial killings, but low-life crook Michael Moriarty knows where the killer bird's nest is located, and he ain't telling without lots of moolah. Seriously odd but entertaining early 80s cult B-movie with some, one suspects intentionally, hokey effects. 13. Intruder. This campy late 80s slasher sees the night shift at a closing down supermarket come under attack from a mysterious lunatic. I vaguely remember this, but I didn't remember it being as totally tongue-in-cheek as it was. By the last 20 minutes I was laughing my head off at it. Spectacularly gory but so deeply dippy I found it impossible not to laugh. I found the music equally hilarious, presumably unintentionally, unless it was some sort of incredibly obscure metatextual joke, as the great majority of it was exactly the same as the dramatic/exciting/spooky music they used to use in 80s Aussie soap opera Sons and Daughters. I found this at first incredibly distracting and then eventually hugely amusing in its own right. This was a really silly movie, but I had a great time with it. I love the bit where the killer pauses in pursuit of his final victim to pick up a couple of items on the floor in the supermarket in order to put them back on the shelf. 12. The Stepfather. Lost's Terry O'Quinn gives a blazing performance as a psychopathic killer obsessed with having the perfect family in this chilling 80s horror thriller. For single mom Catherine Hicks, Jerry Blake O'Quinn seems like the perfect new husband and father figure to her teenage daughter Stephanie, the lovely Jill Sullen. But Stephanie's resentment of her new stepfather becomes a growing suspicion that behind Jerry's cheery facade lies something more sinister. Could he really be the same man that slaughtered another family just over a year ago? A cult classic. 11. Bad Taste. Peter Jackson's directorial debut, the infamously uber-low-budget, uber-gross-out gory comedy horror. Cheap as all hell, but oddly charming in its way. Best bit: the alien leader slurping up the vomit of one his underlings, and then cackling, "Aren't I lucky? I got a chunky bit." 10. Child's Play. Chucky makes his best, and arguably still his best, appearance in this 1988 horror classic that launched a legend. Unmissable. 9. Link. Another absolute 80s classic that's nowhere near as well known as it should be. Link is a delightful tongue-in-cheek comedy horror with a young and absolutely gorgeous Elizabeth Shue trapped in an isolated clifftop house with a very, very naughty orangutan. Absolutely glorious fun. 8. Stage Fright. A group of down-on-their-luck theater actors and their tyrant director get locked in their run-down theater overnight. Unfortunately, they're not alone, because Irving Wallace, a notorious actor-turned-insane spree killer, has just escaped from the local loony bin, and guess who's in there with them? This deliciously lurid 1987 Italian shocker is a slasher cult classic for a bloody good reason, in every sense. Rather wonderfully OTT. 7. A Nightmare on Elm Street. Absolute classic 80s horror. The only thing wrong with it is the very last scene, which is, it must be admitted, rather naff. Otherwise it stands up pretty damn well. Great spooky fun. I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy. 6. Warlock. An evil warlock condemned to hang in the 17th century gets whisked away by an unnatural tornado that lands him in 20th century America. Sadly for him, he's not alone, because the witch hunter that caught him in the first place has tagged along for the ride, and together with a young city girl cursed by the warlock is out to defeat his nemesis once and for all, before he unlocks the secret to destroying all of creation. Julian Sands is an effectively icy villain, and Richard E. Grant and Laurie Singer have great comic chemistry as the mismatched duo out to bring him down in this hugely enjoyable tongue-in-cheek fantasy horror. An absolute blast from start to finish and a total 80s classic. 5. Alligator. A baby alligator flushed down the bog emerges 12 years later as a giant-sized man-eater in this cult classic 80s monster movie. Hadn't seen it for decades until recently, but it was every bit as much fun as I remembered. Highly entertaining. 4. Psycho 2. After 20 years, Norman Bates is released from the mental hospital back into the community, but there are plenty of people who want to make sure he doesn't stay for long. This 80s classic is a gripping thriller that is shot through with dramatic irony, from the vindictive old woman who still wants revenge on Norman for her sister's murder and is manipulating events to try and drive him crazy again, only to regret it when she finally succeeds, and the fact that there is someone running around killing people who is actually trying to protect Norman, but who actually only succeeds in destabilizing him further by making him think he's the one doing it. As the local sheriff notes at one point, if Norman Bates is crazy, There are a couple of other people in this town who are running him a close second. Anchoring it all is a terrifically sympathetic performance from Anthony Perkins as a man who is doomed to never escape his demons, no matter how hard he tries. Great film. I love this far more than the original, which is no doubt a crime in some states. 3. The Hidden. Kyle MacLachlan practically gets to rehearse his Twin Peaks role here as a weirdo FBI agent hunting an alien killer that's jumping from human host to host and leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. This cult 80s classic is an outrageously over-the-top action/sci-fi/horror with plenty of big laughs too. I had an absolute hoot with it. They just don't make 'em like this anymore. To the Fog. John Carpenter's follow-up to his seminal Halloween was seen as a disappointment at the time, but these days is generally regarded as a total classic, and I can only agree. A creepy, atmospheric and thoroughly spine-chilling ghost story. 1. Fright Night Part 2. I can hear the howls of outrage at me putting this here instead of the original, but, sorry folks, I just love this one more. Creepy, funny and sexy, not least thanks to the sultry Julie Carmen and the utterly gorgeous Tracy Lynn. Fright Night Part 2 is one of my favorite films ever. List your own favorites below.